Friday edition of In Touch with Indiana Sports, powered by HoosierIllustrated.com. John Alden with you as always. Welcome to the weekend, or the pre-weekend, however you view this show. But we are glad to have you here. I'm glad to have you here. And Dylan Sinn, our guest of the day, he's also glad that you're here as well. We'll visit with him shortly to talk about all things Indiana basketball, Purdue basketball, the Big Ten tournament, NCAA tournament, head coaching discussion, all that good stuff. So if that wets your whistle, then I'm glad you're on board today. Welcome in to another episode, the end of the week, the end of our 3-episode run of the week. And we got a few different things to get into today. Of course, most of it basketball related. We'll also talk a little bit at the end, depending on how much time we have. We'll talk a little bit of football stuff because spring football starts on Saturday. Yippee-ki-yay. I almost put the expletive on there at the end too. I was getting a little too excited, but I had to hold back from doing that. But yeah, let's with that being said, let's just get into it, shall we? Indiana basketball is getting set for their regular season finale against Ohio State tomorrow afternoon, 3:45 p.m. tip on CBS. I feel like Indiana hasn't had a ton of games on CBS this year, but actually they have more games on CBS than most. I feel like because of the nature of how long football season is, you don't get a lot of college basketball on CBS in general these days. And it does seem like it is tradition, for whatever reason, for the final game of the Indiana regular season to be on CBS for whatever reason. Not that it matters, but I do feel like that's usually been the case. And I do always go back to when Indiana played Michigan on CBS in the regular season finale on the road. And maybe that's why I think that way. So, but the Hoosiers taking on the Ohio State Buckeyes, going for the season sweep against OSU in a game that I don't think we realized how big it was going to be for both teams at this point in the season. I'm sure many teams had better aspirations, or many fans, I should say, of both teams had greater aspirations from where these two teams are right now. Nobody really wanted them to be on the bubble, or maybe thought they would be on the bubble at this point in the year, especially when you look at kind of the trajectories of where both teams were at earlier points in the season. Ohio State was off to a pretty good start. I believe they sat in the top 25 for a decent majority of the early goings of the season. And then they just kind of hit a bit of a lull and found themselves on the NCAA tournament bubble right here at the end of the season, where with Indiana, you had really high preseason expectations, but you had a lot of letdowns early, and expectations quickly, I hate to say, went down the drain, but that's kind of what happened up until we reached a point a few weeks ago where it was announced that Mike Woodson was going to be stepping down. And since then, the team has looked, it's like you guys have heard me say this a million times over the last several episodes. The team just looks different. They play differently. They play freer on most occasions. They play like they have a chip on their shoulder, like they have something that they're trying to achieve. And that can only be a good thing, right? And now they've played themselves back onto the NCAA tournament bubble for the second straight year, or maybe third or fourth straight year. It does feel like they've just lived on the bubble throughout the Mike Woodson era. And this is really a game that I think, no matter who you ask at this point, it's pretty much a win or go home, right? I mean, yeah, you have the Big Ten tournament, and that's fine, but you don't want to have to rely on that to get into the NCAA tournament, because you'll hear Dylan Sinn talk about this a little bit later. I don't mean to take the words out of his mouth, but they don't, and I'm saying the NCAA tournament committee, they don't weigh the conference tournament matchups the same way that they do the regular season games. So you don't want to have to go on a deep run to convince the committee to let your team in, right? So for Indiana, this is for all the marbles. If you want to continue, for all the guys, really, Anthony Leal, Trey Galloway, all those who are likely playing in their final season of college basketball, whether they have eligibility remaining or not, this is it. And I don't want to say that we underestimate the power of March Madness, but until you've played in it, I feel like you probably don't understand how special it is to be a part of something like that. I, of course, never played in it, never played college basketball or anything like that. But you've heard some guests that come on this show talk about how, and I'm referring really specifically to Ant Wright from this past Wednesday, like when you play in the NCAA tournament, it is so different than anything else that exists in sports, right? Not even just college sports, but sports in general. To have something that is without a doubt, in the month of March, you could argue in the spring season in general, the most talked about sporting event over the course of several weeks is college basketball's March Madness. You get 68 teams, and I don't know who coined the phrase March Madness, but kudos to whoever did that, because it has always been madness. When's the last time we had an upset list or a very minimal amount of upsets in an NCAA tournament? Because even in years where it feels like there's not as many chaotic things going on in the tournament, you still have that one or two like monumental things that happen, whether it be a 3/4 court buzzer beater from a 14 seed, or a 15 taken down a 2, or a 16 even taken down a 1. Something that we thought was impossible or would never happen in the NCAA tournament, a 16 beating a 1, has happened twice within the last 10 years, right? Like, I know UMBC, Virginia, that wasn't quite 10 years ago, right? And then we all know Purdue with Fairleigh Dickinson a few years ago. Before those two matchups, everyone always said, like, that's the one thing that had never happened in the NCAA tournament. Now, it's not the one thing. It's the one thing that seemed a little more likely than, a 16 making it to the Final Four, or really any seed above a 12 or a 13, right? I don't know what the highest seed to ever make the NCAA tournament is. Or, I mean, the Final Four of an NCAA tournament. But I do feel like anything higher than a 6 or a 7 is pretty improbable of making a Final Four. That sort of a run. So that's always interesting to see what happens. But there's a reason it's so obscure. Nothing else happens in sports like it, and that's why it's so special to be a part of. And hopefully we'll see a great performance from not only Indiana's seniors tomorrow afternoon, but I hope that we just get an overall. I hope we see a great Indiana team tomorrow. Like, let's just sit and let's stop and think for a second. And I'm gonna take a sip of coffee real quick. Let's all take a deep breath, right? Just sit here and relax. Like, let's forget about the last few months. And I'm talking about with sports. Maybe you yourself have had a stressful few months, whatever it may be. But let's just think strictly with Indiana basketball. This season has not been fun, right? I mean, there's been moments that were more enjoyable than others, but it's overall not been a fun experience with Indiana basketball the last few months, especially when we come off of what was so awesome with Indiana football this year. When you have what is supposed to be your consistent, right? Your consistent thing, Indiana basketball, always there for you. And they're not. And you're looking at the kind of hot new thing, the Indiana football team doing things that we never thought possible. When you see Indiana basketball letting you down, it hurts that much more to watch it, because you're like, this is not the standard, right? So with that being said, let's take that deep breath, and then I'll get into the point I was originally trying to make here. Hopefully you took a sip of whatever you're drinking right now too. Maybe you're sitting at home with a cold one. You're watching this in the evening, cracking a beer. Hope you did that. Maybe you're on your way to work or heading home from work. You got a water bottle with you, or maybe you got some coffee like I do. Hopefully took a drink with that, whatever it might have been. But let's just forget about what happened this past season, all the nonsense. And this is, I know it's cliche, but let's just looking at it from a fan perspective, right? 1 game season. Really, the season, in a way, is on the line tomorrow. Getting to what we just talked about extensively for a couple of minutes, March Madness. If you want your team, Indiana, to play in it, they more than likely need to beat Ohio State tomorrow. So let's I feel like I was trying to remove the stress. Maybe I put it back on, but like it's more so let's have a good time. Let's watch the game. Let's hope for the best, root for the best, and hopefully it'll be an enjoyable experience. Maybe for one day tomorrow, we can look at this Indiana team and say, like, that was a great basketball game. That was a great performance. And I feel like I'm trying to speak something into existence that may not happen at all tomorrow. But if you just sit there and envision Indiana winning by 20 plus tomorrow, the way that we feel like they should, and I'm not trying to take anything away from Ohio State, but if Indiana plays to the potential that we've seen them at the last few weeks, and you don't have to beat them by 20. I'm just throwing out like the perfect scenario. But let's just say Indiana plays one of the better games of their season and they come away with the win where you're not upset with how things played out. Maybe the officiating was maybe subpar, but it doesn't matter because Indiana still played a hell of a game, that sort of thing. So maybe I didn't make a lot of sense there. I hope I did. But hey, I'm hoping to have a good time with the Hoosiers tomorrow, and maybe you will too. I will not be doing post-game show tomorrow. Actually, we may or may not have one at all. I don't want to say definitively just because of all of the things going on with Senior Day and the guys who will be doing coverage at Assembly Hall for us. So not sure if I'll have a post-game wrap-up show, but if so, you know where to find us right here on Hoosier Illustrated. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Hit that notifications bell, and you'll know exactly when they go live, I should say, if they decide to. So with that being said, before we get into some other things, actually, I was going to say before we get into we're going to bring on Dylan Sinn here in just a moment. I want to do a quick update on the Indiana, or I should say the Big Ten women's basketball tournament going on. Indiana defeated Oregon yesterday, 78-62. And I know I'm talking about giving an update, but after this show posts, the game that I'm about to mention will already be underway. And that is, of course, Indiana's quarterfinal matchup with number 2 USC, the number 1 overall seed in the Big Ten tournament. Going to be a tough one for Indiana. USC's only lost twice all year, to Iowa and to Notre Dame, I believe. But hey, home crowd, Gainbridge Fieldhouse. Imagine getting an upset against one of the best teams in women's college basketball right now. So they'll continue their run in the Big Ten tournament against one of the best teams in the country. And then you also got Michigan and number 15 Maryland taking in action at 2:30, Nebraska and UCLA at 6:30, and then Iowa and Ohio State are the nightcap at Gainbridge Fieldhouse for the women's Big Ten tournament. Now, back to what I was originally trying to transition to, and that is our friend Dylan Sinn. We're going to talk more about what we've been talking about, of course, Indiana men's basketball, a little bit of Purdue stuff, and then, of course, the head coaching search going on with Indiana in the background as well. So without further ado, let's continue, or I should say, let's begin this discussion with Dylan Sinn right now. Joining us here on a Friday from the Fort Wayne Journal-Gazette, it is Dylan Sinn. Glad to have you back on In Touch with Indiana Sports as always.
Absolutely, John. Thanks for having me on. This is going to be fun.
It is. Hopefully it will be. Let's talk. We're going to, of course, do a lot of basketball discussion here. We'll talk Indiana Purdue Big Ten tournament, and we'll start with the Hoosiers because if I remember correctly, I believe the last time you and I chatted was kind of right after, Mike Woodson had been announced that he'd be stepping down. A lot of things were not going right for Indiana, but since then, the Hoosiers have really kind of figured some things out. Now, they did just most recently lose to Oregon, and they put themselves in kind of a must-win situation against Ohio State. In my opinion, I do think there's a scenario where if you do lose to Ohio State, you could go on a very deep Big Ten tournament run and probably still get in the NCAA tournament. But I think if you want to be comfortable in your Indiana, you need to, first off, defeat Ohio State tomorrow at Assembly Hall on Senior Day.
Yeah, I think that's right. And the thing is, the Big Ten tournament path is much, much more difficult because, and we've talked about this before, but they weight Big Ten, the selection committee weights conference tournament games lesser than regular season games. Mm-hmm. They don't take them into account quite as much. And we saw that with Indiana a couple of years ago when they were right on the bubble in Mike Woodson's first season. And then they beat Michigan and Illinois, 2 tournament teams, including the number 1 seed in the Big Ten tournament in the first 2 rounds. And it was like, okay, they're in for sure. They're fine. And they ended up being the last team in the field. The selection committee does not want to change the bracket once they have it set. And so you really have to win a lot of games in the Big Ten tournament for that to happen. The easiest way to do it, just go out and beat Ohio State on Saturday on senior day. Big game. You already beat Ohio State once on the road. Go do it at home. Finish this off and kind of, I think a lot of people would agree, punch your ticket on that day.
I was talking with somebody else the other day, and they believe that it's actually a bigger game for Ohio State if they want to keep their NCAA tournament chances alive. Do you think with all of the hubbub around senior day, even though senior days kind of look a little bit different now with a lot of one-year players and that sort of thing, do you think there'll be kind of more pressure on Indiana to put forth a good performance more so than Ohio State to just kind of come in, play their game, and hopefully get what would probably be considered a minor upset in this scenario?
Yeah, it's interesting because what I saw this morning was Joe Lunardi had Ohio State as the last 4 byes and Indiana as the last 4 in. At least that was yesterday. So I think it's one of those things where it's actually pretty much a winner go home game for both teams. I think this is kind of only one of these teams is going to get a bid. I think maybe you could see a way for both of them getting in, but it's going to be tight. So Ohio State has the advantage of they beat Kentucky by 20 in the non-conference slate. And so that win has really propped them up as the season has gone on. So even though their record is lesser than Indiana, I think they're 17-13. Indiana's 18-13, or 18-12, I should say. And so I think Ohio State has the advantage there to a certain extent. Obviously, if Indiana wins tomorrow or on Saturday, that's going to change. So I do think it's going to be a really interesting environment because obviously you said senior day is going to be different because it's been different because there's so many one-year guys. But for Indiana this year, you have Trey Galloway and Anthony Leal, who have been there for 5 years, are going to be going through senior day and talking to the fans.
For the second time, we should mention.
Exactly. And there were some fireworks last year, if we remember.
Yeah.
And then Luke Goody is probably going to go through senior day almost certainly. Another Indiana guy, even though he's only been there for a year. And then Mike Woodson is going to speak to the fans. For the first time since he announced that he is not coming back, he is going to speak to the fans. This is going to be a pretty interesting day at Assembly Hall, especially if they win that game. I think there might be some kind of score settling happening after that game would be my guess. At least a little bit, but we'll see. It's going to be a really interesting day.
Now, looking ahead to the Big Ten tournament, I don't think it's solidified just yet. You can correct me if I'm wrong, but I do think there's a very high likely chance that Indiana's first opponent will be Oregon in the Big Ten tournament. Now, there may be some things that could happen that would shake that up.
I think what it is, basically, if they beat Ohio State, they'll play Oregon. If they lose, then they would be the 9 seed in that case. If they lose, they'll be the 10 seed, and they would play, I believe, Minnesota. I don't check me on that, but I know it's either if they win, they play Oregon. If they lose, they play someone else, I believe.
Oddly enough, I feel like if they were to lose, I think the matchup against a Minnesota team would be more favorable for Indiana. But at the same time, if you look at the fact they just played Oregon, it was so close. It was unfortunate that Jackson Shellstad hit kind of that late game 3-pointer that really sealed the deal for them. Really, it shouldn't have sealed it, but it ended up being the deal sealer. But do you kind of like, if Indiana were to play Oregon, do you kind of like the idea of having a revenge game that quickly for them in this case?
I do, absolutely. I think that it would be Oregon coming to Indiana. Now, obviously, the tournament's in Indianapolis, right? So it would be a very pro-Indiana crowd. It would be a significant difference from what it was just the other day. And, of course, Oregon would have to be flying across the country. That game's at noon. That'd be basically 9 a.m. their time. So it's going to be a body clock game for Oregon. We'll see how that goes. Like, obviously, Oregon's whole thing is they play very, very hard. They play very physical basketball. I do wonder if that kind of takes even more of a hit than other teams when you fly across the country, right? Because it's tough to put in that kind of effort when your body is a little bit fatigued. So I'm interested to see how that goes. I'm interested to see how Oregon kind of handles that, even if they're not playing Indiana, quite frankly. So I would be interested in that matchup, especially after Indiana seemed frustrated with the whistle in that first game.
Yeah, Mike Woodson definitely.
Mike Woodson, absolutely. And then you go into that game, it's like, all right, let's back that up. Let's show that if the whistle is a little bit fair, we would have won that game. And you have some motivation there. But got to beat Ohio State first.
And looking over at the crosstown rival, Purdue, they're going to be taking on Illinois. I believe that's tonight
That is
in
tonight,
their
yeah.
regular season finale at Illinois. What do you have to say about that particular matchup, and if there's any sort of maybe seeding implications, not for the Big Ten tournament, but for March Madness, of course?
Well, there are seeding implications for the Big Ten tournament. First of all, Purdue wins that game, they get one of the double byes. If they
Okay.
lose, they would need Maryland to lose to Northwestern, so pretty unlikely. So it's kind of a win and double bye situation for Purdue. Right now, Purdue is kind of right in the middle of the 3 seed category. I think they would probably. It seems pretty unlikely that they would move up to a 2, but they could move down to a 4 if they lose this one and then lose the first round of the Big Ten tournament. So there's some motivation for Purdue here, and it's going to be a tough game for them. Illinois is one of the best rebounding teams in the country, and despite Purdue's kind of reputation over the last couple of years, they are not a very good rebounding team this year. They've struggled in that area, mostly because Daniel Jacobson has been hurt most of the year, but they were very good in that area in the second half against Rutgers. I think they had a 16-2 advantage in second chance points in that game. Caleb First was a big part of that. He had eight rebounds in the second half, 5 of them on the offensive end. So they're going to need a big effort from him against Illinois, because Illinois crashes the glass. That's what they do. They're long, they're athletic, they're tough at every position, not just the forward, not just the center, even at guard. So I'm interested in that matchup. Purdue's kind of gotten back on track here with a couple of wins over UCLA and Rutgers. They finished the season off with a win at Illinois. I think you can kind of say that Purdue is kind of shaken off what they were struggling with a couple of weeks ago and gotten back to where they want to be.
Yeah, them to go through what they went through. I mean, I'm not saying it's absolutely the reason that Indiana was able to kind of get Purdue at Assembly Hall, but it was very kind of fortunate for Indiana when you look at how things were going for them, and Purdue was kind of going through a slump at the time. I'm not trying to make, I feel like I'm making an excuse for Purdue. I'm not really meaning to, but it was a very interesting scenario, especially the way that Indiana was able to kind of take over that game in one of the weirdest runs from the end of the second half, pretty much into the first several minutes of the second half. One of the more interesting comebacks and then dominant endings in a game that we'd seen Indiana play in this year.
Yeah, I mean, it was one of those things where that is the Indiana is the type of team that Purdue really has trouble with, just in general, not just the style of team that they have trouble with, which is really highly athletic guards who can bother Braden Smith in the backcourt, right? And that's what Indiana was able to do in that second half. Braden Smith had 1 assist and 5 turnovers in the second half of that game, and that's going to be the key for teams going forward to play Purdue is, can you really put pressure on Smith, and can he hold up against it? And he did a really good job of that. I thought he did a better job against UCLA of holding up against that pressure, because they tried to do the same thing, but they don't have the on-ball defender that Anthony Leal is, quite frankly, or Miles Rice is. Miles Rice, very good on-ball defense in that game against Braden Smith. So I think it was one of those things where it showed Purdue a weakness that it has, that it kind of knew, but had been latent since early in the season. And now they went out and have tried to fix it. Did better against UCLA, obviously better against Rutgers, which is a terrible defensive team. Now, can you go do it again against an Illinois team that is really going to try to put the pressure on?
Real quick, I was asked this the other day, and I don't know that I gave the best answer, but I'm curious your thoughts now. How likely do you think it is that Anthony Leal could win either Big Ten Defensive Player of the Year or be on that all Big Ten defensive first team?
I think it's pretty unlikely he wins Defensive Player of the Year, just because he didn't start for half the season. It's a little bit tough, right? But I do think he deserves all Big Ten all defense spot there, because I don't know of any other player in the conference that has guarded Braden Smith and Danny Wolf this season and held his own against both of them. He did a very good job against both of those guys. I think Yasir Roseman said last week he's guarded the other team's best player in like 9 straight games or something like that. He's really good. And it's one of those things where it's such a cliche, but so much of what he does doesn't show up in the box score, but he just helps Indiana win in a way that, I mean, it's not obvious with the box score, but if you watch the game, it's pretty obvious that he affects what Indiana does defensively in an extraordinarily positive way. And I think he deserves all defense consideration. Absolutely.
Do you think if Indiana had one more, and this doesn't necessarily correlate to his defense specifically, but any sort of award, especially when you look at like the Heisman, that sort of stuff, usually it goes to the best player on the best team. do you think it's kind of best defender on the best team in this case scenario? If Indiana was maybe 6 or 7 wins better, this would be more of a runaway for him, that sort of thing?
I can absolutely see it. Yeah, it's one of those things where if Indiana was like 25-6 or whatever it is, 25-5, you start to feel a little bit differently, right? But they let some of those games get away. Some of those early in the season he wasn't starting. They had Kanan Carlisle in there instead, which it made sense at the time. That's kind of what they brought Kanan Carlisle in for. But it's the second straight year now that they've decided, all right, Anthony Leal, we're going to ride with you down the stretch of the season, and things have really turned around. So that tells you something there as well.
I want to get into some head coaching discussion before we wrap up here in the next several minutes, but I don't believe you and I have had much of this conversation so far, but I've talked with numerous people, kind of gotten some thoughts on who the favorites are. Like if it ended up being somebody in particular, would it work out, that sort of thing. Who do you kind of see, at least at this point in time? I know there's not been a ton of movement when it comes to names that have really, been considered the front runners necessarily, but who at this point in time do you see Indiana pursuing most likely whenever this thing really starts heading towards next season?
Yeah, so here's what I will say about this is that, number one, there has been a dearth of information from this search, even relative to other coaching searches. Like that, usually by this point, there's some kind of like the national reporters are like, here's a list of names that Indiana is at least considering, right? We haven't even gotten that, right? Like Scott Dolson is playing this one extremely close to the vest. It's possible that he is doing more background work right now because so many of the candidates that he's looking to hire or would be looking to hire are still playing basketball right now, right? It's going to be a little bit difficult. But I think that that's one of those things where Dolson played the Curt Cignetti hire extremely close to the vest. Remember, we didn't even hear Cignetti's name as a possibility until basically 24 hours before it was done. So that's might happen in this case as well. But just from a general sense, my sense is that if they can get him, I think Indiana would hire TJ Otzelberger. The question is whether he wants to come, because his buyout is much lower than it was previously reported. I think people had previously been reporting it was like $12-15 million. Apparently it's only $4 million. He got that extension in December. Now there's been some rumors that he is working on another extension with Iowa State, but the problem is, and this is the problem for Iowa State, and it's why I think Otzelberger is a real candidate for Indiana, Iowa State doesn't have the cash to really do a whole lot more there, I don't think. They're not a big-time spender, and so Indiana could really trump them with a really high-level offer here, and they would be able to get a good coach out of it by doing so. He's the type of guy that you do spend that money on if you have the opportunity to do so. So I think that Otzelberger is a candidate. I think that Mick Cronin is a candidate, and I think that his body language after that Indiana-UCLA game seemed to suggest that he would consider it, quite frankly. He doesn't seem all that enthused about being at UCLA. Maybe I was reading that wrong, but he clearly has respect for Indiana. He said that it's one of those programs that you hear about, kind of like UCLA, and he kind of joked about being on the hot seat at UCLA sometimes. So it's one of those things where I think he'd consider it. So
and he's done a lot of complaining over the last several months and had some very off the wall sound bites. I think that's really one of the things that turns me off about him. But at the same time, I kind of understand at least part of it when you think about the fact that he hates that they have to have all these cross-country road trips whenever you're one of these West Coast schools. This would be a very, I don't want to say an easy out for him, but maybe that's really the perfect way to put it when you think about it, because it's a step up. Well, is UCLA and Indiana, are they on the same level as when it comes to program tradition? Or where would you kind of put that at this point in time?
Put tradition to the side for a second. It's a step up in terms of resources. He spent all of last season talking about how UCLA does not have its NIL situation in order. That was the problem last season where they were struggling. He kept talking about it, and they gave him some more this offseason. He went out and got some players, and they're better this year. But that was a big source of friction between him and UCLA, was our NIL situation is not in order. Indiana's, by all accounts, is. And I think that's what, forget about the tradition, forget about the championships, who cares? It's resources right now. And I think for him, it would be a significant step up to go to Indiana, similar in terms of prestige, and he'd get to move back to the Midwest where he spent most of his life before moving out to California, and you get fewer of those road trips, right? So I think we might end up in a, like, we had this last year with, I keep going back to the last season with Kentucky and Louisville and the way their searches played out, right? Because that's a pretty decent analog to Indiana as those two schools. Both of them heard several no's, and then they went down to a coach that a lot of people weren't particularly happy with at the time that has come in and won immediately, right? I think there's a chance that Indiana, they've heard, if you believe they actually asked Brad Stevens, they heard no from Brad Stevens. They very clearly,
the Brad
yeah,
Stevens nonsense has been getting on my. I've even referred to him as he who shall not be named
sure.
when it comes to Indiana
I
basketball
totally get
because
that. Yeah.
it's complete. It's complete. It's a facade, is what it is at this
Yes.
point.
No, 100%. Like he's not going to be the coach of Indiana. They heard obviously Dusty May is not going to be the coach at Indiana after signing the extension with Michigan. If Otzelberger says no, I'm staying at Iowa State because of my family ties here, fine, great. Now you're getting into okay, who is the best coach available after that group? Available being the key word because like you hear names, Buzz Williams, Grant McCaslin, guys like that. They're not leaving because those schools can match Indiana financially. They can just say, well, what's Indiana offering you? You got it. Those schools are swimming in cash, right? UCLA probably can't. I mean, UCLA probably could theoretically, but are they going to match a huge offer from Indiana for a guy that they're pretty lukewarm about at this point? Probably not. I think it might end up being Indiana gets down where they just need a decent coach, and Mick Cronin wants out of UCLA and ends up being a marriage of convenience that I think would work out pretty well, quite frankly.
Yeah, it'd be interesting. It does worry me that maybe his best days are behind him, but that doesn't mean he can't have a couple, 2, 3 more really decent runs. And I'm not saying he's about to retire, but every coach goes through, like Tom Izzo, for example, he's having a resurgence right now at the very end of his career. Up until this year, when's the last season that Michigan State was really, really good?
Yeah. 2019 when they went to the Final Four. Here's what I'll say. Mick Cronin is 20 years younger than Tom Izzo. 19, I should say. Mick Cronin is younger than Matt Painter.
Wow, I did not know that.
Yes, Mick Cronin is younger than Matt Painter. UCLA went 31-6 2 years ago, right? Like they went to the Final Four in 2021. Like he's 53 years old. I understand that you would rather have someone younger, but here's my thought on that. If you end up with Mick Cronin and he's 53 years old, and say he tells you when he takes the job, I want to retire at 60. Okay, to me, he seems like a basketball lifer that's going to be in the job until he wants to be. But if he tells you that, okay, great. You retire when you're 60. We get 7 years out of you. You build the program back to consistent success, right? We make a couple Sweet 16s. We make maybe an Elite Eight in there, maybe a nice run if things break right? You're 7 years from now, you're sitting there. Okay, what do we do now? That's when you make the run at Dusty May again. That's the way I'm thinking of it. If you go with Mick Cronin, he's a little bit older. You don't get your coach of the future, quote unquote. Then he rides it out until he retires, and then you go after Dusty May. The way I'm thinking about Dusty May right now is like Jeff Brom at Louisville, where he was at Purdue for 2 years. He was at Purdue in 2017 and 2018, and Louisville fired Bobby Petrino in 2018. And they came in and said, all right, Jeff, do you want to be our coach? And Brom thought about it. He'd done pretty well at Purdue for a couple of years, and he said basically, no, I have only been here a couple of years. That wouldn't be right. I have more to do here, right? But 4 years later, he'd been at Purdue for 6 years. He'd won a division championship. He'd done everything there was to do at Purdue. Then Louisville called again and said, hey, Jeff, do you want to be our head coach? And Jeff said, yeah, I do. And I think that there's a decent chance that ends up happening with Indiana and Dusty May. He said really no this time.
I've not heard anybody lay out the Dusty May prognostications, if you will, like that. And that makes a ton of sense if you really think about it. So I want to ask you about one more coach, if you don't mind. It's somebody I've talked about quite a bit, but I've gotten some pushback. Maybe not me personally, but I've seen why people have been pushing back towards someone like Ben McCollum over the last couple of weeks or so. And that's because his style of play, it's so reminiscent of Archie Miller.
Yeah,
and
it's Archie PTSD. Yeah.
And if you don't have that terrible tenure that was the Archie Miller era, when you look at up and comers that look like they're going to, whether it be, McCollum's going to get a big job somewhere, whether it be this season or next season, whatever it may be, he's eventually going to be somebody's next big hire. And I think that may be the thing that keeps Indiana from really taking a risk with somebody like him, because if without the style of play, he looks like the next Kurt Signetti, if you will, right? I'm sure you've heard that a million times, but he's had so much success at lower levels. He's never really had that chance at a bigger job. And I don't know if that'll be Indiana or somebody else, but it feels like wherever it's gone, it's transitioned to be successful. So but with the whole Indiana thing and the Archie Miller PTSD, as you mentioned, do you think that would keep them from hiring somebody like McCollum this time around?
So it's tough. Here's what I will say about that. Indiana basketball is not Indiana football, right? I think people need to that needs to be clear. Indiana basketball purports to be in a higher stratosphere, right? And a higher stratosphere comes with different pressures of the job. Okay. Ben McCollum, I think he's a good coach. I think he will probably get a bigger job eventually, but he has been in Division One for 1 year. There is like, I'm not sure what kind of NIL budget Drake has. It probably isn't very big. That is a huge piece of what a college basketball coach does nowadays, is manage an NIL budget and kind of oversee things, right? You have to be a coach and you have to be a general manager. Ben McCollum does not have almost any experience in that at all, right? And so I think that's why Indiana would rather hire. In Indiana, the way I'm thinking of it is, I cover Notre Dame football, right? Notre Dame, after Charlie Weiss, they needed someone who was proven, right? They hired Brian Kelly, and he didn't get them over the hump, but he got the program back to national relevance and consistent success, right? You need a Brian Kelly before you can get a Marcus Freeman. Before you can take a chance on someone who isn't proven and who you think in your gut is a superstar, you need to have someone who can take your program back to consistent success, so that there's that infrastructure in place for a guy to lean on who doesn't have that kind of experience, right? So that's why I think that Indiana needs to hire someone who's proven, who has won at a Power 4 level in the past, before you can take that chance on someone like a Ben McCollum or even a high-level assistant at a different program, right? Like Arizona was able to hire Tommy Lloyd, who was previously an assistant at Gonzaga, because they had had years of success to build on in the past. Indiana doesn't have that. Now, Mike Wood, to be clear, I think Mike Woodson has done a pretty good job of building a program infrastructure, even if he hasn't won enough basketball games to stay the coach, right? I think that's what he did between Archie Miller and now, was to build up ties with Montverde, ties with other big schools, and on the recruiting trail, prove you can get guys to Indiana. That is a big deal. But I do think that it's one of those things where you need to hire a proven winner, get back to winning 25-ish games 4 out of 5 years, and then maybe take a shot on a rising star the next time.
And that makes sense too, because from the Indiana football perspective, they were kind of out of options. They're like, we've tried everything. We've got to do something a little risky here, and it paid off. So it makes sense why Indiana football went that direction. Indiana basketball is not really in a position where they need or probably would even really want to do something like that. So it makes a lot of sense. Appreciate your insight as always, Dylan. I appreciate your time, and look forward to talking again soon in the future.
Absolutely, John. Thanks for having me on. This was fun.
A big thanks, as always, to Dylan Sinn for his time and insight. And we look forward to having him on once again, whenever that may be. Always enjoy our conversations. So welcome back into the John Alden segments of In Touch with Indiana Sports. I'm going to get into some YouTube comments here in just a moment, but I'm trying to pull something back up. I don't know why I removed this from my tabs. And the reason you're seeing me finagle with it live on the air is because I didn't realize I deleted this off of my tabs. But I'm trying to pull back up Joe Lenardi's updated bracketology that you heard Dylan and I reference during that segment. And yeah, you heard us mention that Indiana currently situated as one of the last 4 in. I believe whenever we discussed bracket things on Wednesday, that's kind of where we assumed Indiana would fall after they lost to Oregon, and pretty much solidifies, like we said earlier too, with Indiana, Ohio State kind of both being, major bubble teams. They kind of both need to win in order to stay in that conversation. Also, one other Big Ten team find themselves in the first 4 out, and that would be Nebraska. And I mean, I don't know exactly what the Big Ten tournament bracket will look like here in a couple of days, but if you end up having to face Nebraska in an early round, that could also be something that may be seen as an elimination game for Indiana or in Nebraska, of course. Also, just real quick, as Indiana is placed in the last 4 in, Indiana is slated to face off with San Diego State of the Mountain West. Indiana also, last time they were in the first 4, they played Wyoming from the Mountain West. So That would be interesting. Any matchup would be interesting, right? And if they were to win, again, these are all just hypothetical scenarios. They are in the region that is the South region, Atlanta. They would move. Oh, I love this. I love and hate it. I hate it because if things go wrong, it would be embarrassing for the second time this year. But I was thinking about this earlier today because I guess I might as well just mention who it is in case you haven't seen it already. Indiana, if they were to win their first four matchup, they would go out to Providence and face the Louisville Cardinals. And of course, all of you remember the embarrassment that was Indiana's matchup with Louisville in the Bahamas. Man, and again, for me personally, I would love nothing more than for Indiana to find. It's not that I hate Louisville. It's not that I hate Louisville or their fans or anything. But that matchup and just what came from it was so embarrassing on all fronts. Like it was seen as Louisville's coming out party. Like, we're back, baby. Like, the Kenny Payne era is over. And yeah, that was cool for them. But to be the victim of that sucks, right? So to be able to kind of avenge that in a game that means more, of course, than the battle for Atlantis. I mean, I love nothing more than that. Like, give me that matchup all day long. I don't care if Indiana gets whooped again. They're moving on from Mike Woodson. Nothing's different, right? We've already had our embarrassment. I don't think it could happen again. I would probably be staying off of social media because I'm sure I'll see the same people. Again, not necessarily ragging on Indiana. Some were, and that added to, throwing me to the wolves or whatever you want to call it. But if it's bad again, I don't know if I could take it. Even though I said it doesn't matter, but I mean, that would be great. And if they won, and look what they're trying to set up here. There's so many things. This other thing, it's not Kentucky, by the way, and this is more of a setup for Louisville. They've got St. John's as the 3 seed. Of course, Rick Pitino. So, like, they're really, and not only that, you're playing in Providence, like the home of the mafia, right? Maybe I'm wrong about that, but with Rick Pitino having the, Italian roots and that sort of thing. But I would love to see Indiana take on St. John's. Like, that would be a fun little region right there. You have 3 big names, Indiana, Louisville, and not that St. John's is a big name, but Rick Pitino's a big name. And the little old Towson just kind of sitting there as the 14th seed. You never know. But those are the kind of things that you set up there in a bracket and then nothing happens. That's where you get San Diego State and Towson somehow playing in the round of 32, right? Something super dumb like that. But I would love to see that play out. I don't know if Joe Lunardi, he's usually, I've said this before, he's usually pretty wrong with a lot of his predictions. So I'm not saying this will happen. It honestly probably wouldn't. But I would be more than happy to see Indiana get a shot at revenge against Louisville. So will happen. I'm going to say probably not, but we can dream, right? And then the other team that a lot of fans will be looking at, where Kentucky falls, they're currently a 4 seed, I should say, in the west side of the bracket, meaning they wouldn't face, if Indiana were to meet Kentucky, they would not face off until the Final Four, which is Indiana making a run to the Final Four? Probably not, but hey, we can dream, right? Kentucky is a 4, and also in Providence, by the way, though. They'd face High Point and Yippee-ki-yay. Purdue's a 4 as well. Akron's a 13. I don't know why I keep saying yippee-ki-yay, by the way. It's just, I don't know if it's becoming a crutch, because I don't think I say it that often, but maybe it's become the crutch of the day for yours truly. We'll see. Now I want Indiana to perform well, even more so tomorrow. Like, come on, Hoosiers, get it done against the Buckeyes. Don't make us sit far away from March Madness. And like, I say that I'll still watch it. Like, March Madness is a television event that you cannot miss. I'll still bet on it. I haven't done a lot of basketball betting in the last few weeks. I'm in a place where I'm very happy with I'm not made like hundreds of dollars, but I'm in a place where I'm very happy with the amount of money I've got in my account. I'm plus 50 from where I started. And so I've been kind of backing off, because what I didn't want to have happen was get back to even, because I'd lost a few in a row. I didn't want to get back to even before March Madness and then suck it up during March Madness and be in the hole. So I'm saving my last stance for gambling for the year will be when March Madness rolls around, and hopefully we can get some wins going on. I did really great during bowl season, so maybe I can finish on a good note when it comes to gambling when all that stuff rolls around. Speaking of March Madness, one thing I might do, I don't know if I will or not, but I used to do this on the other show that I used to be a part of before I started doing In Touch with Indiana Sports. We may do a Hoosier Illustrated bracket pool that we can set up with ESPN and something like that. Maybe we'll do that. Maybe Hoosier Illustrated already does that, and I just haven't talked with Kyler or Alec about it. But if they haven't already done that in the past, then we'll see about setting that up this year. And I don't know if we'll have anything to like give away or anything like that. It may just be for funsies type of thing. But if we end up deciding on what to do, whether or not we'll do that, I'll be sure to let you guys know, and I'm sure they'll let you know as well. So what do we do now? Let's move on to some YouTube comments, shall we? And we're going to get into something, I don't know for how long. We're going to get into something that I teased the other day and never got into because somebody did comment about it on YouTube, and I appreciate it. So we'll do that here in just a moment. But let's just get right into it, shall we? Got a few comments I'm going to read, and we'll start with the one that I just sort of teased from our friend Mike Shenanigans. First of all, he says, shout out to episode number 90, which was the last one. Appreciate that. We are, this being number 91. And I guess also before I get further into this, now is as good of time as any to mention that I am, I won't say trying because I'm not actively doing anything, but I've got sort of a special guest in mind for episode number 100 that I'm going to reach out to here in the next week or so. And it's somebody that has not been on this show before, I'll say that. And I'll probably say no more right now because I don't want to get any hopes up and, fail at securing the guest that I am trying not to mention the name of, but we'll see. So that's what's in the works for episode number 100. And even if I can't get who I want to get, I'll still try to do something unique for episode number 100. But we do our best around here. At least we try to. But let's get into the rest of what Mike Shenanigans had to say. He says, as far as Woody, and I should mention what he says before this. He says he enjoys, Ant's perspective on things in NCAA basketball. I don't know if he'll be watching this episode, but I'm sure he'd appreciate that. And then he gets into, I had thrown out a sort of a teaser the other day, and that was something I saw on social media from somebody else. So again, apologies if I don't mean to be stealing this, but it was, would Mike Woodson be allowed to stick around, I should say, if he went on a run to the Final Four? Excuse me. And Mike says, as far as Woody, no. It seems he is starting to figure some things out as a college basketball coach, but he is still not one. It is on the way of being 4 years to do it in some form or fashion. I think that's fair. It doesn't necessarily answer the question on would Indiana keep Woody with the Final Four? I don't think they would. I don't think they would. It'd be one of those things where Mike Woodson would do that. He'd probably shove it in people's face, but I think he would still step away because why not go out on top right now? Final Four doesn't necessarily mean that you win the national championship. You could, and it does kind of feel like once you get to the Final Four that anything is possible, right? All you got to do is win 2 games. It's a 2-game tournament, as they say. But Mike Woodson, why would you? You've at that point, if you get to the Final Four, you've done what Indiana fans have been wishing for forever, is get back to the Final Four. And again, he's already playing with house money. You're playing with even more house money at that point. Would people be yelling for Mike Woodson to stay? I'm sure there'd be some. Again, there'd be a lot of people saying, you should have given Woody more time. Those who are upset about it, and that's totally fine as well. But we talk about the fluky Final Four as well. Look at Mike Davis. He had a Final Four run very early on in his career, and he couldn't top that ever again. And that could be a similar situation right here with Mike Woodson. And you can also blame all of it or credit all of it to the fact that there is no pressure right now. Seriously, there's none. There's been pressure every other season at this point, and there's whatever Mike Woodson does at this point, it's considered a bonus because everything else has already played itself out. So hopefully I answered that question in the way some of you were. I mean, I'm not answered it in a correct way, but hopefully that answers the hypothetical. But Mike, I appreciate your comment as always. Let's get into a couple more. Kevin Casey says, big fan of Robbie Hummel. I'd be interested to know if he didn't play at Purdue, who would have been his next choice? Not even just him. I've always thought that's interesting to know what players think down the road after their career. That is a very interesting point. And of course, he's referring to, I played the sound on Wednesday, I think it was Wednesday, of Hummel weighing in on who the next coach would be for Indiana. And I talked about how I just love his ability to be objective in every way, shape, and form, especially when he's on the call for whatever network he may be doing a broadcast for. And, you mentioned, Kevin, that where would he play if he didn't go to Purdue? I mean, obviously, I don't know the answer to that, but I've wondered the same thing with certain guys. Like, I've heard conversations before with former Indiana players where, like, they throw out ideas. It's not necessarily where they would have gone if they didn't go to Indiana, but they talk about, and I'm thinking about players who played during the early years of Tom Crean. Like, let's just imagine that NIL and the transfer portal are around, and you have the ability to just get up and leave if you hate what's going on. Like, that 6-win team, I mean, do you think a lot of those guys just say, oh, this is horrible, I don't want to be a part of this, and just get up and leave? You probably would have some do that. I don't know how many would, especially when you throw an NIL, because you would have been able to kind of build some things together a lot easier and a lot quicker with NIL. So maybe we'll never know what would have happened. Now, if it was just transfer portal and NIL wasn't a part of that, then you probably would have a lot of guys who were on those bad Indiana teams jump in the portal. So that would have been unfortunate. We would have never seen guys like Jordan Hulls potentially have their moments in the 2012 season. There's so many guys like Verdell Jones, Christian Wofford, any of those guys from 2012 that were around for a few years. That was something that we, the journey of that progress, that even makes sense. The journey of those players to get to where they got to and eventually winning a Big Ten championship in 2013. That's something we'll never see happen in, that slow of a fashion. It's really the only way to put it, because you can flip rosters so quickly. I know I mention this all the time, but Curt Cignetti in the season they had, that never happened. That would never, ever happen 10, 15 years ago, even 5 years ago, because you just couldn't do that. Turnarounds can happen so quickly, and it's changed the game in college athletics forever until they do something that maybe regulates bringing almost an entire roster over to help things out and that sort of thing. So move on to one more comment. Jim Reynolds says, and he's speaking on the conversation with Ant Wright on Wednesday. He said, Ant needs to know we don't mention, quote, getting over the hump around here, even if talking about Minnesota. He's referring to Ben Johnson being the head coach there. And I don't know if you caught this. Surely you did, Jim, if you're listening. But getting over the hump, that's exactly what did. I think Dylan had used that phrase during our conversation today. So I don't know if that qualifies as something we shouldn't say on this show either. But hey, I guess getting over the hump, no matter what, people always just think of Mike Woodson nowadays. So whoever the next head coach is at Indiana, surely somebody will jokingly mention him like, hey, this is a phrase that you better not use in a press conference, especially if things aren't going well, because they'll immediately think of somebody else when you say it. Now, it would honestly be kind of funny if whoever the next head coach ends up being, you finds a way to use it in a comedic way. Now, maybe that would be seen as making fun of Mike Woodson, so maybe you wouldn't want to do that. But it would be funny to see somebody mention getting over the hump, like getting the introductory press conference, just to kind of mess with people. So, but thank you for the comments as always. Anytime there's a big slew that come through, I like to get through a few of them during different episodes. So appreciate you guys as always. And we'll wrap it up here in a few minutes, but I do want to talk just briefly about something that we'll probably get in depth with more next week. And that is with spring football starting beginning on Saturday. Maybe we'll try to hook up with our friend Mitchell Page on the show once again and just kind of talk about football. And it's not starting back up, but the spring football practices and the spring game is just around the corner. So we'll talk about some things that are worth keeping an eye on. Of course, the biggest one, Fernando Mendoza, the new quarterback for Indiana, is, expected to be the starter, filling in for Curtis Rourke. The biggest thing that I think, at least for me, when it comes to Mendoza versus Rourke is expectations going into the season for Mendoza versus how Rourke's expectations were. Because with Rourke, you really didn't know. You were a G5 quarterback who had never played at the Power 4 level, and you're coming off of an injury. And so it was really just kind of a wild card. Like, how good was Curtis Rourke going to be? What would his ceiling be? We really didn't know. Mendoza, he has high expectations. And part of that is his own record at California. The other part of that is what Cignetti was able to do in year one. So pressure is going to look a lot different for all of these guys coming into this upcoming football season. And another name to keep an eye on will be Roman Hemby, the running back from Maryland, who will he end up being the guy for Indiana, or will it be more of a running back by committee like we got with Tyson Lawton and company last year? So that'll be interesting to keep an eye on. A couple of storylines. We'll get in more in depth with that, with all that and more next week. And again, like I said, we'll see if Mitchell is able to join at some point, or even somebody else affiliated with football if we're able to do that. So looking forward to that. And we'll also have Big Ten tournament stuff next week. So it's going to be a very busy week. I'm not really sure what shows will look like, because if there's games going on in the middle of the afternoon, we may do something a little bit different. Again, we'll have a regular show on Monday, but then moving forward, we'll have to maybe evaluate some stuff or reevaluate some stuff. We'll have to wait and see. But that'll do it on today's show and for this week of shows. Appreciate you guys as always. Hopefully you enjoyed it. Look forward to being back again next week to do all of that again and more. So until then, this has been another edition of In Touch with Indiana Sports, powered by HoosierIllustrated.com.